Good evening, everyone. My name is Gina Duvernay, and I'm the Adult Services Manager for Gwinnett County Public Library. Thank you all for being here. We're really thrilled to have our author of the evening, Elaine Weiss, here today, along with our moderator, Robin Morris. So I'll go ahead and just read their bios and kick it off. Elaine Weiss is an award-winning journalist, author, and public speaker. In addition to Spell Freedom, she is the author of Fruits of Victory, The Woman's Land Army of the Great War, and The Woman's Hour, The Great Fight to Win the Vote. Elaine lives with her husband in Baltimore, Maryland. And Robin Morris is an associate professor and chair of history at Agnes Scott College in Decatur, Georgia, where she teaches courses in modern U.S. history, Southern history, and public history. She is the author of Goldwater Girls to Reagan Women, Gender, Georgia, and the Growth of the New Right. And so let's give them both a round of applause. Before I kick it off, like I said I would, I do want to just thank our bookseller for the evening. The bookseller is the name of the bookseller in Conyers, Georgia. So we're thrilled to have you here tonight, and you can feel free to support our bookseller here for the evening. But I'll go ahead and turn it over because we have a very interesting conversation in store for you all.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. And thanks for coming out tonight. It's really exciting to see all of you. I'm also a native of DeKalb County, so it's always great to get to support the public libraries that shaped me as a reader growing up. So yay. And I'm really excited to talk about this book. I was just telling her that I have so many connections to the stories in this book, and I think you're all going to know some familiar names and places that we'll talk about. So just as a quick introduction, this is a really expansive history of a long civil rights movement, and you cover a lot of familiar events for anyone who's probably taken a state history test or read a newspaper, the Montgomery bus boycott and the March on Washington and others. But you really root the movement in what you call the underground schools. So can we start by having you tell us about them and why you place these deep roots of the movement there?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can everyone hear? Okay. Yeah, so this is a story that takes the reader through the movement and even begins before what we would call the movement gelling in the wake of the Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954. It begins on that day when the court makes its announcement of the case. But it takes readers in the years before, when the cases were being developed, some of them in South Carolina, and then it takes you into the early campaigns of the movement. But I root it in 4 characters who are probably people you've never heard of before, and that was very purposeful because we know the big names. We know the big names in Georgia, and Hosea Williams is in there. And certainly Dr. King and all the SCLC and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, they're all in there. But you go through the movement with the eyes of these 4 sort of ordinary people, lay people. They're not ministers, they're not fiery students. They're a school teacher, a middle-aged Black school teacher, a beautician, a small businessman, and then a white man who is a liberal white man from the hills of Tennessee. So you are seeing the movement from a different perspective, and I think that's valuable because I think we're tending to think of the movement as these icons, and they certainly deserve to be icons. But that wasn't the whole movement. The movement had to come from the ground up, otherwise it would not be successful. And what the lens I use are these citizenship schools, which again, Dr. King and Andrew Young, your former mayor and congressman here, he was actually involved in these. He was under the SCLC. He became the director of these citizenship schools called Citizen Education Program. And he said this was the backbone of the entire movement, because this brought citizens in the rural areas, in the cities, in the towns, into the movement in a really meaningful way. You're not going to march. You're not going to sit in. You're not going to stand up in a very courageous way because you are facing real danger. You're not going to do that unless you're ready. You're politically ready, you're spiritually ready, you're physically ready. And these citizenship schools gave citizens, many of them unlettered, illiterate, the skills and the confidence and the knowledge to stand up, to register to vote, to do all those things that the movement was aiming for, to sign petitions to have their children desegregate schools. And they faced enormous retribution for this. So you had to be ready. And this was a way at the very ground level that people entered the movement through these citizenship schools. So that's why I chose to use that as the vehicle to explain the other things. You can't really know why the Birmingham campaign was so important until you realize that in Birmingham, a lot of citizens had been trained already, and certainly so in Selma, and in lots of little campaigns, desegregation in Atlanta. So that's why I chose to do it, and I like to tell stories that haven't been told before.
Yeah. And I want you to describe what some of these schools were, because when we think of schools, we have an idea. So can you describe a couple of these?
They're not the brick and mortar schools you might think. They're not even Rosenwald schools, which were wonderful schools for children. These were for adults. And these were not edifices by any stretch of the imagination. These were community classes run by volunteers. So they were held often in a kind of secretive place because it was dangerous to be either attending these schools or teaching them. And so the people who taught them after it entered its expansions phase were, again, hairdressers. They were held in funeral parlors after hours. They were held in grocery stores. That's how they began. In the backs of people's homes, in automotive garages with the doors closed. So they would be neighbor teaching neighbor. They weren't college kids from outside coming in. They were your neighbors. And so there was a sense of trust, and that was a part of the whole program. And if you volunteered to become trained as a citizenship school teacher, you would go for training with the people that I write about. Some of those were in Dorchester County in Georgia, south. And you would spend a week learning not only the curricula, but also how to set up a school, how to protect your students, how to protect yourself, what your constitutional rights were, and then you would teach these. So they're very informal, and they may run for years, and they might run for 2 semesters. So it really depended. By the time the Voting Rights Act is enacted in 1965, over 900 of these, sprinkled all around 11 southern states, have taken place. And again, it's peer-to-peer because they didn't want to intimidate people. A lot of these people had never learned to hold the pencil. I write in the book about the first class. And these were laborers on the Sea Islands, and they had been robbed of a decent education. We know education is a means of control, and the white establishment had not allowed them to stay in school very long. They had to go back into the fields. And so they had to learn how to grip a pencil. That's one of the first things. And then learn to sign their names by muscle memory. It was called kinesthetic writing, where you just have a template, like and you write your name again and again and learn how to sign your name. And this transformed people because they suddenly could sign documents where they'd had to have their boss or their pastor or the man down the street sign for them. And suddenly, I feel like a man, I feel like a woman. And then they learn their letters and they can read and write. And it really makes a huge personal difference to them. And then they learn the Constitution. They learn they're entitled to these rights and they should be demanding them. And then they learn how to organize. So that's what the schools were. And they begin, the first one is behind the back shelves of a grocery store. A grocery
I
store.
love that.
With no windows so that people couldn't peer in, and it was purposefully put there. So that's what they are. They're not what, you call them schools, but they're really informal classes of neighbors teaching neighbors.
Yeah, on all of the ways they were hiding from white people. It looks like a grocery store, but it was a school. I'm sorry, I have to spoil it. But there was one woman who was having these lessons while someone was in her beauty salon. And, white men weren't going to go in a black women's beauty salon. So she's teaching them how to read and how to understand their rights. And it's so brilliant.
Yep.
Yeah.
It was beauticians played a big role in the movement because they were independent businesswomen. So they weren't beholden to a white employer. And they often bought their supplies from black suppliers, so they weren't going to be cut off. They were trusted in the community. They had a special role. There's a rapport with your hairdresser. You talk about things you might not talk about. And one of the women, we're talking about this fantastic organizer in Clarksdale, Mississippi, Vera Peggy. But also one of my main characters is also a beautician, Bernice Robinson. And she, and I think this is Mrs. Piggy too, their beauty shop becomes the NAACP satellite office, where she not only lectures them about the importance of joining the NAACP, which we'll talk about was a dangerous thing to do. It was considered subversive and un-American. We're hearing that today. So these beauticians said, you know what? If you want to join the NAACP, use my beauty shop address and have all the mailings and your membership card and everything sent here. So the white mailman won't know, and your pastor, who may be a little skittish, won't know. Maybe your husband won't know if he's nervous about this. And so her shop became an NAACP affiliate.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think this gets us into something that really stands out in your book, that you said you mentioned some of the familiar names that we know of, Martin Luther King and John Lewis, but you really focus on a lot of these women of the movement. Septima Clark and Dorothy Cotton and Vera Peggy. I was getting so excited. So can you talk about the ways that women's contributions to the movement differed, and maybe how their obstacles also differed?
Yeah, so one of the things that modern historians are beginning to talk about is that very little of our civil rights history involves women. The great men of the movement, and they were great men, but behind them and empowering them and organizing them and in the field were women. And this was known at the time. It's not like these women didn't understand what was going on. Women had been the field organizers for the NAACP. They had been, secretaries of the state chapters. They played enormous leadership roles in the years before 1954. And so when a movement begins to coalesce with, a flicker here, a flicker there, they are there and they know people. And someone like Ruby Hurley, who was an NAACP organizer. Dorothy Cotton was an no, actually, Ella Baker was an organizer, one of the great organizers. And so they know how to organize people. Rosa Parks was secretary and sort of vice president. She ran the Montgomery NAACP office. E.D. Nixon was the head, but she kept it going. And so women had organized. They knew how to run an organization because in the segregated South, there were separate benevolent organizations. There's a Black YWCA and a Black YMCA, and the Tuberculosis Society is segregated, and Black women took leadership roles in this. So it's no wonder that there is an historian, I think it's Alden Morris, who said, in the civil rights movement, men led, but women organized. And that is certainly true. And through their letters and their memos and their memoirs, I began to understand how peeved the women were about this. Rosa Parks talks about the March on Washington in 1963, and the fact that no woman was invited to speak. And none of them, not Ella Baker, none. And she's very annoyed by this. They all were. They actually had a meeting the morning after to talk about this because they were not allowed to go to the White House for the meeting with the president. They were just shunted aside. They even walked down the avenue differently from the male leaders on a different street, Independence rather than Pennsylvania Avenue. And Rosa Parks writes in her memoir that those of us who didn't sing, meaning the great singers, Mahalia Jackson and everyone who's at the march, those of us who didn't sing didn't get to say a word. And she was very angry about it. And Septima Clark, who was my main character, the school teacher who Dr. King calls the mother of the movement, because she is the one who develops and propagates these citizenship schools and trains all the teachers. She is very annoyed by how she's treated at the SCLC and rails against Reverend Abernathy for continually saying, why are there women at this executive board meeting? He didn't think women, he says, and she says, he didn't think we were smart enough. And so you see, cultural differences. This is the 1950s and early 60s. You see, pastors who are used to being in charge. So, there's all kinds of cross currents going on. But even the young students in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and SNCC, there was a lot of tension with the men taking charge. Women like Diane Nash, who was, led the Nashville sit-ins, were given subservient roles, and they were angry about it. So I think bringing up these names, bringing up their roles, saying, don't forget them. They were very, very important. This movement would not have gone anywhere without women organizing. To a certain extent, we know that men were targeted for retribution more often. It seemed unseemly to attack a woman, though they did. They murdered. There was murder of women. There's a terrible incident. I'm not sure it's in the final book, but it happened in Florida, where a husband and wife were both teachers, and they taught Black history in the schools, which was illegal. Again, something to think about. And they also were the NAACP heads in the county, and they were running a voter registration drive. And on Christmas Day, their house was bombed, and they were both killed. And the voter registration brochures were floating in the air from the bombing. So we have to remember what the risks everyone was taking, women and men.
And I'm not going to tell you what, but King would have been a lot better off if he had listened to Septima Clark.
Yeah, in several
Yeah,
instances.
many, many, many times. But listen, I always tell my students that my thesis for all of history is that women do the work and men take the credit. And it works for about any movement. And it definitely was coming up in here. So I have yet to be proven wrong on this thesis. And it really came out. There were times that I was just like,
Why don't you listen
I
to
yell
her?
at my books. I have thrown books, but I did not throw this one. But yeah, I was just like, listen to her, listen to her. So speaking of some of your characters, you discuss Miles Horton, who is a white man who led the Highlander Folk School in the Tennessee Hills, and Septima Clark, who's an African-American woman, who was one of the founders and created the vision for the citizenship schools in the South Carolina Sea Islands. And they're so opposite in so many ways. But it seems that their work and their movements really reinforced one another. So could you talk about their friendship and their professional relationship?
Yeah, so Miles Horton is a son of the Cumberland Mountains, born in rural Tennessee, grows up poor, gets an education, goes to college, and then goes to graduate school in theology and sociology. He's searching, and he doesn't think he can be a minister, but he has a real a church background. And he's looking for his own purpose. This is now in the 1920s and early 30s. And he comes up with this idea of a folk school, which was this folk school movement in Europe, where they would bring communities together to discuss common problems and bring their culture in. And we know this is, culture reinforces a sense of identity and strength, and especially community strength. And so they would bring in the music and the art of the region, and then have people talk frankly about what's wrong, what could be done better, and then go home with a plan, a mutually agreed plan. And he thought this was really important. And he brings this idea and starts this Highlander Folk School outside of Chattanooga, about 50 miles outside, in the mountains, very remote. And he runs it. He begins in 1932 in the depths of the Depression, and it becomes a center for labor rights. So labor, the miners who are striking, the steel workers, the farmers, they all come to Highlander to learn how to organize and learn what their rights are and plan their resistance to abusive labor practices. Around 1950, he realizes that the South can't advance unless it tackles its racial problems, that nothing will happen. There'll be no progress unless it comes to a reckoning. And he has always believed that all this segregation stuff was nonsense. He refused to abide by it. He flaunted the fact that he was breaking the law every day in Tennessee by running an integrated establishment. So when you went to Highlander, everyone ate together, slept in the same rooms together, did dishes together. It was danced together, all these forbidden things. And they were proud of it. And he had this great phrase. He said it was the only place in the South where people could tea and pee together. They could eat and they could also live together. And so he begins to pivot his school. There would be like residential workshops, and academics came, and labor leaders and pastors from all over the South, liberal pastors, black and white, came to discuss problems. And there'd be a theme of the week or the 2-week program. And one of these, the school teacher, Septima Clark, who'd been an activist, she's on the board of the NAACP in Charleston, she comes to one of these in the summer of 1954, just a few weeks after the Brown decision, which kind of galvanized the communities and said, okay, we can do something. The government is finally recognizing that separate isn't equal. And they could see that even though this the decision was about schools, it opened the door to desegregating other facilities. So it's not the first, it's not the opening of the movement, but it's a great galvanizing moment. And she comes, and for the first time, now she had eaten with white people before, and she had has an interesting relationship with some white people in Charleston, which is very, very influential for her. But she's assigned a roommate, and it's this white woman from New Jersey. And there's a scene in the book where she's in her nightgown, staring up at the ceiling and saying, "My mother would have just fainted if she knew I was," and this woman doesn't seem to mind at all. And it's just a revelation. And the same thing will happen to Rosa Parks. It'll be the first time she sits down and has a meal with white people in her life. And she's in her mid-40s. John Lewis will come as a 19-year-old seminarian studying at American Baptist College in Nashville. He will come for the first time in 1958 or 9, I'm getting 58. And it's the first time he has eaten a meal with white people. And it changes. He said he leaves that place on fire. And it's Septima Clark, who he really admires on this weekend when he goes, because at this point she's become staff at Highlander. And he said she understands that this movement is not going to be run by elites. It's going to be run by the people. It's going to be run by poor people. It's going to be run by people in the fields and people in the cities. And she understands, she knows how to reach them. So he can see how powerful her message is, and she influences him greatly. So so these Miles Horton and Septima Clark disagree sometimes violently in arguments at Highlander about how these schools should be run and what the curricula should be and what the goals should be, and but they respect each other, and so they do work closely. They clash, and it's very interesting. At one point, they clash pretty significantly, and Septima Clark was just amazed that she could yell at a white man. Like, it's a big moment of she could yell because they were equals. They were equals who disagreed, and that was a big revelation for her.
Progress.
Yeah.
You did say one thing I want to be sure we hear, that Rosa Parks was in her 40s, so she was not a little old lady who sat on a bus. So please stop saying that unless you want to admit to being a little old lady, which I'm not ready to do.
And she was also an activist. She and her husband were the center of activity in Montgomery. There were meetings there every night of the week in their apartment. He had been a defender of the Scottsboro Boys. They were controversial. She ran the youth council, the NAAC youth council, getting young people involved, training them. So she had been in the movement for a long, long time. She's very discouraged when she first comes to Highlander in the summer of 1955, because she doesn't think her community will stick together and really be able to do anything. She's just, the pace is so slow. People are so reluctant. But she comes to Highlander. She's very shy. She's very scared. She's never been in this kind of situation. And Septima Clark, she won't speak. She barely eats. Septima Clark goes to her dorm room and tries to, draw her out, make her feel more comfortable, says, "You're safe here. Don't worry. The white people are not going to report you to the authorities." She hadn't told her boss at the department store where she was a seamstress where she was going. She was very, very nervous. And finally, in the final days, she begins to loosen up after about 10 days. And she then really enjoys it. And she says, the best part was waking up in the morning and smelling the bacon and eggs and knowing it was white people making those bacon and eggs for her. And she said that was just a great moment. And she too is eating with white people for the first time. So she writes in her notebook. She took copious notes, which you can see. You can actually see them in the Library of Congress. And she writes these notes, and one of them is, desegregation will be proven by being put into action. And 3 months later, she refuses to give up her seat. And she credits Highlander. You know, it wasn't that she was tired. Yeah. She credits Highlander. She didn't plan to do it that day, but she said, I had been pushed as far as I could be pushed, and I just was not going to say it. So it was very controversial. And one of the things you read in this book is how much she suffered. You know, we think of it as this great act of resistance, which it was, but she suffered, and her family suffered for many, many years. She was impoverished by this. They had to move to Detroit, and they still couldn't get it. They were blackballed. They were fired. She got hate mail. She had to become the subject of object of charity. She hated that, but she was not going to back down. So it's a different story than perhaps you've heard, but it's the truer story of what she went through.
And I love that Highlander hadn't prepared her for this to be a communist, which was usually something they prepared. They said she was so quiet. We didn't think she was going to do anything.
They were shocked. Actually, Septima Clark and Miles Horton were shocked when they read that the news came that Rosa Parks had refused to give up her seat. They said, Rosa? Rosa, she was the most unlikely student we've ever had to do that. They can't believe it. And they realized, so at one point, Miles Horton takes her to New York and takes Rosa Parks, and she meets with Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt plays a great role in this book. And so Mrs. Roosevelt, says, I want to know all about this. I'm so fascinated by you. Tell me, has Miles told you already? Have you been accused of being a communist yet? And Rosa Parks says, no, they didn't tell me I'd be. She said, she berates, she says, of course, you should have told her that she was going to get. And he said, I didn't expect her to do this, I didn't expect her to do anything. But he actually does go down like the day after and prepares her and says, this is going to get rough, and it will be. And so Mrs. Roosevelt writes a whole column. She had a daily newspaper column called My Day after she left the White House, and she wrote about Rosa Parks, meeting Rosa Parks. And she says, this didn't come out of thin air, this act of defiance. It comes because people have been pushed so far and so long, and we have to expect that this is going to happen. And, we hope it'll take a positive turn. She understood it all. She really did.
Yeah. So the role of education is at the center of some political debates today. And at the start of chapter 36, you wrote, the citizenship classes had always been about more than simply voting and literacy. It was training for the mind and spirit, learning a new way of thinking, feeling empowered and self-reliant. It was about learning to question, analyze, and take action. So I was thinking about how we are now debating public education, higher education, the Department of Education. And you give us a lot to think about with the power of education and fear of education. So what does Spell Freedom tell us about the role and the potential of education as a tool for social and political change?
Yeah, that's a great question. Septima Clark's whole credo was literacy is liberation. And she meant that both in the very practical learning your letters, but it was learning about the world. These citizenship schools didn't just do the letters and didn't just do the South Carolina or the Georgia Constitution. They did, what your rights were and why it was important to work as a community and why it was important to read Black history. Black history was part of the curriculum. And they learned to sing. Music was, as we know, it was a singing movement. Well, where did people learn this? Well, it comes out of the Black church, of course, the whole Black church culture, It comes a bit from the Sea Islands, which also had a singing culture in their praise houses. But it also comes from Highlander, where singing was always part. Every night at a Highlander workshop, people sang. They sang all kinds of songs, labor songs, spirituals. But when the movement begins, they teach a song that they'd been singing since the 1940s, a labor song that was brought by Black women who had been on strike at a tobacco plant in Charleston. And it comes from a hymn, and it was brought to Highlander and it was kind of jiggered around and made easier to sing, and it is "We Shall Overcome." And Dr. King hears it for the first time at Highlander. But education in the broadest sense of becoming a person, of becoming a citizen, of knowing not only your rights, but your responsibilities. She drilled in that you have responsibilities as a citizen, not just rights. You are responsible for voting and voting intelligently. There were classes in how to evaluate candidates. I wish we had that now. And Esau Jenkins, who's this wonderful Sea Island businessman who invents the citizenship schools on his bus, he says, he teaches the second step, and he says, education is so important. You have to be educated about the people who want to represent you. And don't fall for a candidate who buys you a chicken dinner or who promises to be good for one night and then is going to abandon everything that's important to you. Look at his voting record. Look at his speeches. Really push that elected official and make sure that they're going to do what's right. And so the people who come out of these classes are really attuned. They really have studied this. So it's education in the broadest sense. And what scares me now is, of course, education is under attack. Why? Because it is a vehicle for agency and confidence and action. And so when we hear school boards saying, Black history should not be taught, that's what they were saying in the South. That's what they were saying should not be taught then. And some teachers were very brave. Septima Clark always slipped it in her public school classes. And we're hearing that. And we're hearing that certain words are not to be used. And that there's to be no Women's History Month or Black History Month. These are come out of fear, but they also come out of an understanding of how powerful education is. So I think those teachers and parents on the front line have to understand how dangerous it is to restrict, to say, you can learn this, but not this. To understand American history, understand our whole national story. Black history is at the center of it. I really believe you cannot write American history without it. My previous book was about women's suffrage and how women won the right to vote. And race was a big part of that story. And I emphasize how big race was in that story. So I really think we have to stand up and say, no, that's not how our educational process should be. We should be exposing our children and our neighbors to this. One of the excuses for some of the restrictions that are now being placed is that you don't want to teach divisive topics where some people might feel uncomfortable learning the history of abuse that took place. And I say history is supposed to make us uncomfortable. That's its value. If we don't learn mistakes, then we're going to doomed to practice it again. But it's also important to recognize what the mistakes were, recognize how those happen, see how they were overcome at a certain point, and learn from it and do better. I mean, that's how you teach your children. You don't say, "Oh, you did that really bad. Well, just forget about it, and you can go do it again." That's not education. So I think limiting history to topics of victory and domination and success is a very, very short-sighted thing to do. And I hope that teachers and librarians who are on the front line and parents will come to realize that all this banning of books, all this restricting topics to be discussed are very, very dangerous and self-defeating, really self-defeating.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to open up for questions. I know you've all got some, so. Maybe while they're getting the courage, I could ask one. Oh, yeah. Do you have one?
Hey, I was surprised, I haven't just yet, but I was surprised that you mentioned Edie Nixon. Now, I know that, Lynn got there too, but what do you say about him? Do you feel like he was?
Oh, E.D. Nixon, Edgar Daniel Nixon, was head of the Montgomery NAACP. He was a railroad porter, belonged to the Brotherhood of Railroad Porters, the really, really powerful and important union run by Randolph. Yes. And so he is steeped in organizing and action. And he's tremendous. He really is. And he feels very slighted when Dr. King, who is then Reverend King, 26 years old, in his first pulpit, it was in Montgomery at Dexter Church, went behind the ears and, had no leadership role in the movement at that point, but he's a brilliant orator. And after Mrs. Parks is arrested and they're kind of figuring out what to do, it's a group of women professors. It's the Women's Political Union who comes to the, really takes over and says, we're going to have a bus boycott. And so E.D. Nixon says, okay, yeah, we're going to do a bus boycott. But it was the women who came up with the idea. And Reverend King, the other ministers, Reverend Abernathy says, okay, we're going to get the ministers together. And we're going to do it on your church, King, because he was the youngest and he didn't know any better to know this might be dangerous. So they have it in the Dexter Church basement. And they sort of say, okay, you're the head of it now. And he's, so he sort of stumbles into that leadership, but he's able to bring his oratory powers and begins to develop leadership powers. But E.D. Nixon is really miffed because he had been the leader in Montgomery, and he feels very, very angry and very eclipsed that King gets all the credit. So, it's a human. Movements are human too, and there are rivalries and there are power plays. But E.D. truly, kept the boycott going, and it was more than a year. People were walking. I mean, they really suffered. Children were walking. They were walking to work.
And the women used the mimeograph machine at Alabama State. So I just love that little act of subversion.
Yes.
That Alabama ended up paying for the.
That's right, for the
copies.
For the boycott copies. They began the boycott on the day that Rosa Parks had to go to court and was convicted of not obeying the Jim Crow restrictions on the buses, which were official city ordinances. So the women led in that one.
You expect women to make the copies. We'll make 35,000 of them.
Yes, right.
I love that.
Right, yeah. In the middle of the night, they did it.
Yeah.
Great.
No, when you were talking about the beauty shops, did they also, you had mentioned with the grocery stores and all that, they were in the back. With the beauty shop, were they also in the back? Or were they really in the front because the men weren't coming in there anyway?
Right. I've seen pictures of both in the front and also in a back room with the shades closed. So yes, they were safe places, but you also didn't want people peeking in. And they're not secretive in the terms that nobody knows about it. Certainly when the schools transfer in 1961 because the state of Tennessee closes down Highlander for being communist. It pops up the next day near Knoxville, where it's celebrating its 93rd anniversary now, so it's still going. But the program, this program had become so valuable, they didn't want it to lose it in case Highlander wasn't able to be revived. So they transfer it to Dr. King, and it becomes part of the SCLC. So all the people I write about live and work in Atlanta for the next 9 years. They go out into the field, they go down to Dorchester, it was McIntosh County then. It's changed the name of the county, but it's down.
One of everything.
Yeah. And so they're living here. And in fact, Septima Clark boarded at Reverend Vincent Harding's Mennonite house in Atlanta, which was like an interracial, interreligious community. And she loved doing that. It was just really, it became a clubhouse of the movement. And so she had a room there when she was in Atlanta. So Atlanta becomes the headquarters of the Citizen Education Project. And Andrew Young is the head of it, even though he's 28 years old, has never taught a class except Bible school. But he's a man and he's a minister, so he's made the head of it. And Septima Clark, who's been teaching for 40 years, is under him, and so is Dorothy Cotton, who has a master's in education. So yeah, you begin to see it. But he was devoted to it, and he really, really ran it. They went around on recruiting trips together in Dorothy Cotton's car. And there's this great scene where they're mistaken for a mother, Septima Clark, and her 2 children. And it wasn't so far off because she was like double their age. But they go off saying they're looking for PhD minds. So they're looking for teachers, people who can be trained and then become community leaders. PhD minds with 3rd grade educations. So they could see the potential in people who weren't educated, but had a natural kind of leadership ability or could be cultivated. People would say, I'm not a leader. And they said, yeah, you're a leader. You can be a leader. And so it was that development of the character, the personality, the confidence that made the local leaders who now seated all over the South. So when Montgomery, when Birmingham happens, when Savannah happens, when there are campaigns all over, they're ready. They have leaders. They're organizing. So that's how it kind of works.
And one place she fought with King was that he saw himself as a leader and people would call him to be a leader. And she said, no, tell him to go to the local leaders. And she was really inspirational.
Yeah, she didn't believe
way.
in a single charismatic leader. She loved Dr. King. Yeah. She adored him. She respected him. But she thought, this is not good. That you really need local leadership in order to maintain a movement. And she was right. And there were local leaders. And what happens is after 1970, when she retires, and the movement fractures. And SNCC disappears because they're so disillusioned and so angry. And the SCLC falters. But what happens is a lot of the citizenship school teachers and their students run for office all over the South. Those elected officials often come out of the movement and come out of citizenship school training. So Andy Young says, all of this, in the early 70s and 80s, all of those people had their roots in the citizenship school. So you see it, propagating on its own, and they become part. And of course, he becomes part of it. And I won't do a spoiler, but Septima Clark, after she retires, she's in her mid-70s, runs for office and wins.
And not a spoiler, but John Lewis also ran.
Yeah, he did too.
I don't know if you've heard of it. No.
He did too, but he also after he left SNCC, he went back to school to get his degree, goes to Fisk, and he also then joins the Voter Education Project, which was another level that worked with the citizenship schools, and he runs that for several years, and then Vernon Jordan takes over. So you see the whole movement, you see kind of the structure, all the people you know, but you see them coming into the movement from a different angle. So that's why it's a little different than the usual history of the movement. And I hope it's readable, that it's not, yeah, okay, good.
Well, I like the comment that you just made about being able to see them come into the movement, because a lot of times we only see them once they've reached those prominent levels. And I was recently attended an educational conference, and Andrew Young was one of the panelists. And I couldn't make the connection between him besides him being an Atlanta figurehead, being a speaker at an educational conference, and now I have that connection that you just explained.
Yeah, he was head of the Citizens Education Program for 9 years. 9 years. No, he leaves to run for Congress, and that may have been I think it was in 70. And so he was involved in education. He never had been before, but he does do that. And he was really a champion. He really did push for resources, and education was always kind of shunted to the bottom. Septima Clark complains that when she and Dorothy Cotton were executive meetings, their agenda item was always at the end, which didn't get to. So, but yeah. So
So how did you first come across those topics?
That's such a great question. It was a multitude of things, because I was looking for a way to write about the movement, because I thought my previous book, not my first book, my second book, was about women's suffrage. And I knew that even though the 19th Amendment gave the right to vote to women, in the South, Black women were denied the vote. And I wanted to explore that, why that happened. I knew why it happened. It was Jim Crow laws, and it was suppression. But I wanted to understand what was going on. And of course, it was not quiet. It wasn't like women said, "Oh, okay, we won't vote." I mean, there was a lot of activity. And through that, because that book had taken place in Tennessee, I was familiar with the archives, and I came across this Highlander school, and Septima Clark came up in it, and the citizenship schools. And then I'm trying to think the date, like 2000, maybe 19, I saw a news article that said the Highlander Education and Research Center, which is what it's called now, outside of Knoxville, had been firebombed. And a building had been destroyed, and some records had been destroyed. And white supremacist graffiti had been found on the premises. And I thought, what is the school that is still a target? And that kind of got me to want to explore this. And I went to Highlander for a weekend, and I kind of got my bearings, and I realized that in their archives, there was some very valuable stuff. And then I found these characters, these figures who were so compelling and people didn't really know about. There is a wonderful academic biography of Septima Clark, which I certainly used as background, mining the footnotes, and I take off from there. So a beautician doesn't have an archive usually, but Bernice Robinson's very modest collection is at the Avery Institute for Black History in Charleston, as is Septima Clark's papers, as is Esau Jenkins. So I was able to raise up these people who I find so important that we haven't heard about. And, there's this push now, as we were saying before, for what's called patriotic education. That they want to be patriotic. And my rejoinder is, these are the most patriotic people you will ever meet. These are the people who believed in democracy so completely they risked everything, and in some cases lost everything, to say this is a democracy and everyone deserves to vote and have equal opportunity. And if that's not patriotic, then I don't know what is. So so that's how I came up, sort of through different channels, but then it came together when I found Septima Clark, and then there were these others. So there were other characters. There's the white folk singer, Guy Carawan, and I got to talk to his widow, who still lives on the Highlander property. He's the one who goes around teaching We Shall Overcome in the citizenship schools, so everybody knows it, and teaching it to the young students at SNCC. So you see that song kind of reverberating.
Yeah, it's kind of another character.
It is.
Yeah.
It is almost another character. And for a long time, Highlander owned the copyright for it. It could be used for, in a demonstration, in a song, in singing in schools, but it was going to be used for commercial use. They would get a royalty, and it was used to fund cultural projects in the South. Yeah.
I had not heard of the Highlander School until like the last few years. I didn't know the historical part of it. I had just seen an article, Nikki Giovanni was there, and there was like some other big names that were there.
Ansbury was there.
And then for you to tell me this, it's like, oh, there's like this whole big thing opened up.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, you're very welcome, because it is fascinating. It became really like a switchboard. Everyone came through there, and the ideas came through there, and they would have these workshops on desegregation and the role of parents, and the role of students, and the role of white people. I mean, they were always very conscious that white people allyship was important, but whites needed to take a back seat. And Miles Horton was very, very attuned to that, that the leadership had to be out of the Black community. He could be an advisor, and he was advisor for the Freedom, by the way, the Freedom Schools in Mississippi in 1964, Freedom Summer, they're based on the citizenship schools. And Septima Clark writes some of the curricula, and Miles Horton is training the students who were coming down, many of them white students from the North. It was actually very controversial that they were coming down to Mississippi, but the citizenship school had a different model. They wanted Black community members to teach their neighbors, don't have outsiders. They thought it was more effective. So yeah, it's I think you'll find it interesting to see. It's not there are full histories of Highlander, but this is not that. It's just a very a kind of slice of what they were. Yeah,
And it is still active.
It is still active.
Say that in here.
And I'll
it's
be
still
going there in
active.
May, doing fundraiser for them. They're still very much involved in community organizing, using cultural resources in the South, and they train a lot of community organizing. Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.